The silence screams. People say silence is peaceful. They are wrong. Silence can scream louder than any sound if you listen long enough. Anee moved into the old apartment building on the edge of the city because it was cheap and forgotten. The landlord avoided eye contact while handing over the keys, his fingers trembling as if the metal burned his skin. "You'll hear nothing," he said quietly. A strange warning, Anee thought. Silence was exactly what she wanted. The building had no children, no music, no laughter. Even footsteps sounded swallowed by the walls. At night, the air felt thick, like the building itself was holding its breath. The first few nights passed without incident, but the silence was unnatural, too clean, too complete. On the fourth night, Anee woke up at exactly 3:17 a.m. Her room was dark, yet she felt watched. There was no sound, no fan, no distant traffic, not even her own breathing felt real. She sat up slowly, her heart pounding in her ears, when she noticed something terrifying. Her heartbeat was the only sound that existed. Then it stopped. Not her heart, the sound of it. Panic rushed through her as she opened her mouth to scream, but no voice came out. Her lips moved, her throat strained, yet the room swallowed her sound completely. She slapped her hands against the bed, against the wall, nothing. Absolute silence. And then she heard it. Not with her ears, but inside her head. A scream, 1,000 screams. They were layered, overlapping, desperate. Men, women, children, all crying in pain, fear, and regret. The screams were silent yet violent, clawing at her mind, begging to be heard. Anee ran to the door and twisted the knob. It wouldn't open. The walls began to darken, their paint peeling like burned skin. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, forming human shapes, mouths wide open, faces frozen in agony. Their mouths moved, screaming without sound. One shadow stepped forward, its face empty except for a black hole where its mouth should have been. Words formed inside Anee's mind. "You hear us now." The shadow reached out, its cold fingers brushing her wrist. Instantly, memories flooded her vision, people trapped in this building, screaming for help during fires, murders, suicides. The walls had absorbed their final moments, their voices erased, their pain preserved. They were never heard, the voice whispered. "Now neither will you be." Anee collapsed to her knees, clutching her ears, begging silently. Tears streamed down her face, but even her sobs made no sound. The shadows surrounded her, their mouths opening wider, pulling her scream out of her chest without releasing it. Her voice was being taken. Morning came. Neighbors later reported seeing Anee leave the building calmly, her face empty, her eyes lifeless. She never spoke again. Doctors found nothing wrong. Her vocal cords were perfect. Her lungs were fine. But at night, in that apartment, new screams joined the silence. If you stand outside the building at 3:17 a.m., you will hear nothing. But if you listen carefully, you will feel them screaming inside your head. And once you hear the silent screams, you become part of them. Anee did not speak again. Days passed. Weeks passed. Doctors shined lights into her eyes, asked her to say her name, to scream, to whisper, nothing. Her mouth moved, her throat worked, but sound refused to exist around her. It was as if silence followed her like a curse. At night, she slept with the lights on. It didn't help, because the screams were no longer trapped inside the apartment. They followed her. Every night at 3:17 a.m., Anee sat upright in bed, her eyes snapping open at the exact same second. Her room would freeze. The fan stopped mid-rotation. The digital clock blinked once and went dark. Then the silence returned. And inside that silence, something breathed. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the screams didn't come from outside anymore. They came from within her chest, vibrating through her bones. Each scream carried a face, a memory, a death. One voice became clearer than the rest. "A child. Why didn't you hear me?" Anee's body shook violently. She grabbed a pen and paper, her hands trembling as she wrote over and over. "I can hear you. I'm sorry." The paper began to wrinkle, then bleed. Dark fingerprints slowly appeared on the page, small and burned, pressing from the other side. The letters twisted, rewriting themselves. "We don't need your apology. We need your voice." That night, Anee returned to the apartment building. The door opened by itself. The hallway looked longer than before, stretching endlessly into darkness. Every door along the corridor was slightly open, and behind each one, nothing but blackness. As she walked, she noticed something horrifying. The walls were vibrating, not shaking, pulsing, like living flesh. As she pressed her palm against them, her mind exploded with images. A woman suffocating, a man clawing at the floor, a child pounding on a locked door. All of them screaming. None of them heard. The shadows returned, crawling along the ceiling and dripping down the walls. They gathered in front of Anee, forming a single shape, taller, heavier, older than the rest. "You carry us now," the voice said inside her skull. "Your silence made room for us." Anee shook her head violently. She tried to scream again, forcing every breath, every muscle to obey. Her throat burned. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. Then, sound escaped. Not her voice. Thousands of screams burst out of her mouth at once, tearing through the hallway like a storm. The walls cracked. Doors slammed open. Shadows writhed and collapsed into the floor. Anee fell forward, gasping. But the screams didn't stop. They poured out of her endlessly, echoing through the building, finally heard after years of silence. The walls began to peel, revealing names carved underneath, hundreds of them. When the police arrived, the building was empty. No shadows. No bodies. No Anee. Only one thing remained. A security camera recording showed Anee standing in the center of the hallway, mouth open, eyes black, soundless to the camera. Yet every officer who watched the footage later reported the same thing. They couldn't hear anything, but they all felt the screaming. And every night since, at 3:17 a.m., people across the city wake up suddenly, clutching their chests, ears ringing, certain that someone, somewhere, is screaming without sound. Because Anee did not escape the silence. She became its voice. Long before Anee ever stepped into the apartment, before the city surrounded it with lights and roads, the land was known for one thing. People disappeared without a sound. The building was constructed over an old asylum that burned down decades ago. Official records said the fire killed everyone instantly. That was a lie. The truth was buried, just like the survivors who were sealed inside when the exits collapsed. They screamed for days. No one came. The fire had stolen their voices. Smoke burned their throats. By the time help arrived, silence ruled the ruins. But pain does not vanish, it soaks into walls, into soil, into air. The land learned how to remember suffering. And it learned how to stay quiet. When the apartment was built, workers complained that tools stopped making noise inside the structure. One man fell from the third floor and died. Witnesses saw his mouth open mid-scream, but heard nothing. Construction continued anyway. The building was finished. The silence was sealed inside. Anee was not chosen by accident. She was sensitive to quiet. She listened when others ignored it. The building needed someone who could carry the screams beyond its walls. Now, she existed between sound and silence. At 3:17 a.m., the city began to change. People woke up hearing their names whispered without sound. Mirrors fogged from the inside. Phones recorded static that looked like screaming faces when paused frame by frame. Hospitals reported patients losing their voices overnight, doctors confused, scans normal. Children woke up crying, pointing to corners of rooms where nothing stood. The silence was spreading. Inside the abandoned apartment, Anee stood in the hallway again, but she was no longer human. Her shadow moved before she did. Her reflection screamed when she stayed still. "You opened the door," the voices said. "Now the world will hear us." Anee tried to fight. Deep inside, her own voice still existed, crushed beneath layers of stolen pain. She remembered who she was. She remembered wanting peace. With the last fragment of control, she walked into the center of the building and pressed her hands against the wall that screamed the loudest. She opened her mouth one final time. This time, she did not release the screams. She pulled them back. Every voice, every death, every silent plea ripped through her body. The walls cracked inward. The building screamed for the first time in its existence, audibly. Neighbors heard it. A sound so loud it shattered glass across the street. A scream that lasted exactly 1 second. Then silence. The building collapsed into itself, sinking into the ground like it was never there. Anee was gone. The city returned to normal. Voices came back. Nightmares faded. The land felt quiet again. But silence has a memory. Sometimes, late at night, when everything is still, people feel pressure in their ears, like something is about to scream but doesn't. They check the time. 3:17 a.m. And for a brief moment, they understand something terrifying. Silence is not empty. It is full of screams that chose not to escape. And somewhere beyond sound, Anee is still listening.